Hey, it's Mike here, and today, carbs. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they the devil? Do they cause diabetes? And probably most importantly, do they make you fat? So we're gonna take a level-headed look at the research on carbohydrates and tackle some of the anti-carb myths, as well as some of the super pro-carb dogma that's out there, and try and get some answers. So there are claims on both sides of the fence, pro and anti-carb, that are definitely wrong. And before we get into some of those, I want to lay some groundwork here, and that is in terms of macronutrient ratios. I want to make a distinction because throughout this video, I might say 80% carbs or 50% carbs. And I'm not talking about the weight of that food, and that misunderstanding has led people to unsubscribe because they were so frustrated. I'm talking about the percentage of total calories. So if we're looking at a standard high carb diet, it would be 80% of calories from carbs and maybe 10% from fat and 10% from protein. But if you're looking at a low carb keto diet, for example, it could look like only 5 to 10% carbs, 70 to 80% fat, and 20 to 25% protein. Okay, now to what is possibly the main notion about carbs, and that is that carbs turn into fat. Let's take a look at that. Contrary to popular belief, that is mostly not an accurate statement for the average person, and it's going to be a bit frustrating that all of the answers I'm going to give you are not black and white, which is easy. No, they're going to have some nuance, and so just bear with me. Let's look at this paradigm-shattering study, which took women and overfed them refined sugar, so they had an excess of calories, and whether they were obese or lean women, the result that they observed was that only about 10% or less of the fat that they stored was from carbs that they ate. That means that 90% of the fat that ended up on their body after that study was from fat that they ate. And the researchers' conclusion was, well, there's a slight increase in fat creation from carbs, aka de novo lipogenesis, that does not contribute greatly to total fat balance. And it makes sense why our bodies wouldn't favor turning carbs into fat, because that process, again, de novo lipogenesis, wastes about 30% of the energy from carbs, so it's not a good evolutionary strategy. And perhaps the most important epidemiological nugget in the realm of carbs making you fat is this study on the Okinawans and what they ate around 1950. They ate 85% of total calories from carbohydrates, albeit they were whole carbohydrates in the form of sweet potatoes. And they were the longest lived population on Earth until they changed their diet. They had virtually no obesity and very low disease rates as well. The point is, they ate an obscene percentage of energy from carbohydrates, and they did not get those feared consequences that the standard American is worried about with carbs. But remember, this is not black and white, and this notion of carbs never making you fat can also be taken too far. For example, in the movie What the Health, that section about carbs is often criticized, though they got a lot of other points right. You could come away from that section of the documentary thinking that carbs in no way can ever contribute to you getting fatter. Well, the reality is that if you already have a decent amount of fat in your diet and you just increase the amount of carbs you eat, then it's possible that you're going to be more likely to store that fat that you have in your diet. For example, maybe you are eating 2,000 calories at 30% fat and you're at an energy equilibrium and you're not storing any fat, but then you decide to add 800 calories of just carbs. It makes sense that your body would decide to maybe store some of that fat, even though you aren't eating more fat. So carbs could put you into a calorie surplus, which could lead you to store fat. But when the average person is worried about the bread they eat being converted directly into fat, that's not exactly accurate. It's more like the bread is ushering the fat foods into your body. Welcome, chili cheese fries, chicken wings, come on, I have a spot for you right here. You can just park right there on this person's butt. Then cue the high-carb vegan movement, which partially hinged on the notion that if you just keep your fat intake down below a certain point, you can eat as many carbs as you can fit in your mouth without gaining any fat. So how did that work out for everyone? Well, we'll get to that in a second, but first, I want to mention another benefit of eating a higher proportion of your calories as carbs in addition to de novo lipogenesis, and that is facultative dietary thermogenesis, which is also referred to as just diet-induced thermogenesis. And thermogenesis is the creation of heat, so you're taking excess calories and burning them off as heat. This does not happen so easily with extra fat, but can be induced after a high-carb meal. And from this review, interestingly, multiple studies have demonstrated that obese people exhibit less dietary-induced thermogenesis, which means that they are burning off less calories as heat and probably storing more. And one might be inclined to throw their hands up and say, oh, well, it's probably just genetics. Well, if you look at some other studies, you see that there's only a few pound difference between people with the obesity genes and without the obesity genes, so it's probably more likely a result of dietary choices and other lifestyle choices. But more research is needed, as always. And one thing is for certain though, massively over-consuming calories and relying on dietary-induced thermogenesis is probably not the best strategy, especially in terms of anti-aging. That's because as our metabolism burns calories, it creates oxidative stress, which is a major component of aging. So purposefully overclocking your metabolism is definitely not a good idea. Burning 4,000 calories when you only need maybe 2,000 or 2,500 is, again, not a good anti-aging strategy. And looking back to the Okinawans, curiously, they actually ate at a 10% calorie deficit. They ate 10% less than you would calculate that they need. Although they did eat a ton of nutrient-dense, locally grown vegetables and a lot of fermented foods, so in theory, they could have been absorbing the same amount of calories. Who knows? Just throwing ideas out there. Now for the big question, is there a point where that dietary-induced thermogenesis and that de novo lipogenesis inefficiency fails, and you end up actually storing a lot of fat from carbs? To answer that, we have to go back to Durian Ryder and his Sugar Mountain diet for a very valuable lesson. The Sugar Mountain diet involves pouring obscene amounts of sugar into smoothies, drinking sodas, and other just really bad practices. When Durian Ryder was approached by a 16-year-old girl who gained upwards of 100 pounds and had very high triglycerides, his response was for her to chill out and her triglycerides would go down.
I got my blood test and I have high triglycerides, and lots of people said that
that
too many
spikes your high. My triglycerides, I can feel it elevating just talking with you.
because I have 223.
Well, we aren't here to talk about how ridiculous all of that is. It is worth noting that she certainly did gain a ton of weight by smashing in the carbohydrates for months on end. In this rare case of extreme refined carbohydrate overconsumption, there actually was enough de novo lipogenesis for her to have a clinically significant weight gain. Very clinical. And looking at her triglycerides was a bit of a snapshot in that process. The sugar was being turned into triglycerides, which was then being stored. Well, young Julia gained quite a bit of weight. Here's another girl named Marta who gained about 130 pounds or 60 kilos.
This is not a troll video. I really did gain 60 kilos on the Sugar Mountain diet. For breakfast, I would usually have like a smoothie. Then I would add in probably about 150 to 200 grams of pure refined sugar. Often I would have some canned peaches with extra syrup on, and sometimes I would even drink maple syrup like it was water.
So yes, there is a limit to the overconsumption of carbs, and balance is key here, and I do hope that that very impressionable child is doing better now. Now that that warning has been heeded, again, this is a video of nuance. We need to move on from refined carbs to whole carbs, and that brings us to the Broad Study, which I still think they should have called the Broad Study, which was, as the researchers put it, the largest weight loss in obese subjects at 6 and 12 months without calorie restriction or mandated exercise that they had ever seen. So what diet was that? That was a starch-based, high-carb, by definition, vegan diet. So while on one hand, a massive excess of refined carbohydrates can lead to a large amount of weight gain in particular situations, on the other hand, we have a unbridled consumption of whole carbs being what appears to be a great weight loss strategy. So again, it's not black and white. Life is confusing sometimes. It's hard to figure out the answer. But the weight loss success of whole carbs is largely due to fiber, which is twofold. One, you just can't fit as many calories in your stomach. And two, down the line, it can turn into propionate, which is an appetite trigger. It actually tells your body that you're full. Yeah. And that's not going to happen with refined sugar or animal fat. That's just the reality of it. All right, moving on. Let's talk about diabetes. Do carbs cause diabetes or not? Well, one kind of inconvenient truth is the Kempner rice diet, which was super high carb, not healthy by any means, yet was still able to reverse some diabetic retinopathy, some diabetic blindness in subjects, and diabetes in general. How? Likely because of intramyocellular lipids, which we'll explain more in a second, but simply that fat and sugar do not mix. For example, eating a large amount of animal fat can lead to a buildup in the muscle cell intramyocellular, and as diabetes researcher Dr. Barnard mentions, it can gum up the insulin lock so that your insulin key does not work and does not let glucose in. That then results in insulin resistance, which is a hallmark of diabetes. And I think this paper gives some good background. In the mid-1990s, researchers began to re-examine type 2 diabetes from a more lipocentric, fat-centric perspective, giving strong consideration to the idea that systematic lipid imbalances give rise to glucose dysregulation, sugar problems, rather than vice versa. And that a group of researchers demonstrated that intramyocellular lipids served as a robust indicator of insulin sensitivity. Robust! It's kind of like the mediocre analogy of how too much fat starts a fire, and then carbs are like gasoline, and then so you throw gasoline on the fire, and then boom. So you get an explosion, but without too much fat, without a fire at all, then the gasoline will be all right, just like sitting in a tank. So with that in mind, you can take the low carb route and keep eating a ton of artery clogging animal fats and keep forcing all that fat into your muscle cells, but then just eat such a small amount of sugar that it doesn't even matter that your body's so messed up. It's like you still have that fire, but you're just dropping a single drop of gasoline on it, tiny bit of sugar on it, and so the problems aren't the same. Or you can stop with all the animal fat and continue to eat all the delicious whole carbs like sweet potatoes and wheat pasta and so forth. And all of this is likely why, from the epidemiology, we can see as much as a 78% lower risk of total diabetes for vegans, which is just completely insane. Like, that's ridiculous. And to back all of this intramyocellular lipid stuff up, as Barnard mentions in this study, vegans have been observed with about 30% lower intramyocellular lipid levels. But zooming out a little bit, this whole fear of carbs is so bad that I once heard somebody say, I actually went vegan for a week, but I found myself eating more carbs, and carbs are bad, so I had to just stop being a vegan. And you realize just how ridiculous that is when you combine the way lower diabetes risk with charts like this, which is the BMI of vegans compared to people on other diets, and vegans are the only ones in the normal BMI. And studies do show that yes, vegans eat some more carbs. So for the final question, what do I eat? Do I eat a lot of carbs? Am I a high carb vegan? And you probably know the answer by now, and that is that I do eat whole carbs, and I eat a lot of them. I'm eating all those whole starches and vegetables, and I'm not shooting for any particular macronutrient ratio, but I do end up coming in at around 75 to 80% carbs, and I still make those cashew cheese pizzas and stuff like that, but I don't go super hard into all the really fatty foods. It's just not my jam. So in the end, from studies, it appears that around 90+% of fat that is stored is from fat that is eaten. However, we have the nuance of saying that if you eat a ton more carbs, you might be more likely to store the fat that you eat. And for people going super high carb, yes, you have some extra wiggle room with the dietary thermogenesis and the de novo lipogenesis, but there's a limit there, and clearly some people have gone over that, which is unfortunate. And in terms of diabetes, we have that intramyocellular lipids, which are then exacerbated by the sugar that you eat. And so fat started the fire, but again, it's not black and white. So in conclusion, carbs are not the devil. Whole carbs especially are healthy. Refined carbs are clearly just, they're not. Processed foods are not healthy. I'm sorry, in general, they aren't. Some of them are. Vinegar. So I hope you enjoyed this video, though it might have made things a little bit more confusing in terms of what's good and what's bad, because not everything is just good or bad. Okay, one final thing I do want to mention, a smaller channel, Goji Man. You should go and check him out. He is studying for a Master's of Science in Nutrition, and then he's going to go on to his PhD in Nutrition, and he has some science-y videos on nutrition, so go for it. And also, mention down below if there are any channels that you like that are under, 5,000 subscribers that could use a shout out. And I do want to mention that there is a like button and a subscribe button. You can do with them what you want, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and bye.